I've titled this talk, Intersections, Interventions, and the Homoerotics of Orientalism. 30 seconds make a difference. At least they do in the silent film Mektub Fantasy Arib, and sort of roughly translates, it is written Mektub, Arab fantasy, shot in France in the late 1920s. On first glance, this 6-minute pornographic reel seems to conform to typical Orientalist male fantasy, that of penetrating the forbidden female harem. In this manifestation of the fantasy, an enterprising French tourist named Dicky invades a harem whose master, El-Zab, is away to obtain some unique snapshots with his camera. And it's no coincidence that the master's name's El-Zab, since Zab in Arabic means penis, an inside joke that, like Dicky's name, clues us into the fact that this pornographic fantasy is being staged as a contest of phallic domination, not only between men, but between cultures. With minimal coaxing, Dicky convinces the harem's 2 female inhabitants to unveil, undress, and belly dance to the clicks of his camera. All the actions to this point play as predictable Orientalist fantasy, with Dicky's role as a roused voyeur standing in for the titillated male spectator, and his role as a photographer standing in for the filmmaker, the person behind the camera, who creates and controls the fantasy scenario. As I just noted, this seems like predictable, banal Orientalist fantasy. Predictable, that is, until the entrance of El-Zab in the company of his manservant interrupts Dicky's fraud. Seeking to avenge his honor, El-Zab threatens violence, but then decides to show his magnanimity, as the intertitle puts it, by sodomizing Dicky, while Dicky is simultaneously forced to fillet the manservant. Sandwiched between these 2 robed figures, whose costumes overtly mark them as other, Dicky submits to this double penetration with surprising gusto. The menage a trois lasts a scant half-minute at 30 seconds, after which the heterosexual antics pick up where they left off. Dicky, meanwhile, resumes his trigger-happy role as voyeur and photographer until El-Zab finally ejects him from the tent in a comic turn that ends the film just where it began. Yet this return to narrative quiescence can't quite paper over the difference 30 seconds make. That difference can be measured first by the fact that of the 38 examples of vintage erotica on the DVD set on which this Mektub appears, only 3 of the 38 show instances of male-male sexuality, and second, by the fact that 2 of these 3 occur in Orientalized settings. Western sexual fantasies of the Orient, it seems, are especially liable to eruptions of sex between men that, however temporarily, disrupt European norms of masculine heterosexuality. This short film staging of homosexual activity in a Middle Eastern setting isn't an isolated incident in pop culture's borrowings of Orientalist motifs. I'd be happy to share various instances where the ostensible heterosexual fantasy is interrupted by manifestations of male-male desire. Given the minimal, to say the least, artistic credentials of most of this material, one might be inclined to dismiss it as unworthy of sustained attention. But it is precisely as expressions of popular culture, stripped to the most basic of narrative templates, that such material illuminates a dynamic central to my book's thesis, namely the ghostly presence of something like male homoeroticism that haunts many Western men's fantasies and fears of Middle Eastern sexuality. While the association of foreignness with general perversion is a phenomenon common to most cultures, every culture wants to say the other one's diseased and perverted, blah, 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 the intensity with which Western imaginations have associated the Muslim world with male homoeroticism is noteworthy. No other geographical domain on which the Anglo-European gaze is fixed at sometimes imperial, sometimes covetous, sometimes simply curious eye has been so associated with the specter of male-male sexuality over so many centuries. Musing on such homoerotic hauntings of the past into the present, critic Dina Al-Qasim addresses the difficulties for scholars of sexuality, like so many of us, of knowing and naming the desires that we moderns think we hear in the archive. Al-Qasim is referring to Muslim culture and the gap between its present regimes of sexuality and its disavowed homoerotic past, which scholars like herself are busy uncovering, particularly in the last 6-7 years. In contrast, the primary focus of my book concerns Anglo-European perceptions and fantasies of that heritage. But the critical issue for both projects remains the same, whether we're coming from a Middle Eastern angle or from an Anglo-European one. How can all of us scholars excavating the history of sexuality responsibly put into word those desires expressed in past eras or different cultures from our own that we think we recognize but cannot quite name, since such emanations only reach us as echoes, as ghosts, as translations, traversing time and space? Further, how is the desire to retrieve such traces of sexuality complicated when those half-heard desires are ones that have traditionally been marginalized and tabooed, censored and distorted, both in their home cultures and abroad? Faced with abundant cautions about the dangers of inadvertently projecting our culturally learned scripts of sexuality onto other cultures, scholars here in the U.S., queer and otherwise, have been schooled perhaps too well at times to respect the limits of knowing and naming these ghostly textual voices as they echo across time and space. And yet, as Al-Qasim also warns, such wariness comes at a certain expense. The equal risk of obliterating the legible, if not quite translatable desires echoing from the historical archive if we stop our investigation short out of fear of overstepping disciplinary and cultural boundaries. Crossing such boundaries is a risk this book, The Homoerotics of Orientalism, embraces. I do so in order to open a dialogue between, first, Western perceptions and fantasies of homoeroticism in the Middle East, second, queer theory as it has evolved over the past decade, and third, the burgeoning field of sexuality studies in the Islamic world. One of the truly pressing needs in humanistic study, as contemporary world politics demonstrates, is a more nuanced understanding of the myriad ways in which West and Middle East have been constructed in opposition to each other. My book draws on literary, textual, and visual artifacts produced over some 450 years in order to probe the deep history of homoerotic fascination and homophobic aspersion that has helped create this mythic divide between Middle East and West. It's a commonplace, of course, that the Middle East has been fodder for European heterosexual fantasies for centuries, as so much Orientalist literature and artwork make abundantly clear. What has undergone less systematic scrutiny, however, is a large number of Anglo-European and U.S. writers, artists, travelers, and thinkers, by and large men, who over the centuries have found themselves gripped by and compelled to attempt to represent what, to their eyes, has seemed to be the relative abundance of erotic relations between men in the Islamic world. Sometimes this homoeroticism is the result of overwrought flights of imagination based on misprisions of unfamiliar sexual and cultural practices, and sometimes it stems from contact with the culture at hand. Sometimes it's been overtly figured as voyeuristic spectacle, and sometimes it's formed the clandestine secret goal of the traveler's erotic journey. But whether feared or desired, the mere possibility of sexual contact with or between men in the Middle East, I argue, has covertly underwritten much of the appeal and practice of the phenomenon we now call Orientalism, sometimes repeating, but just as often upending its assumed operations. In expected and unexpected ways, this vast body of work is indelibly marked by its encounter with Middle Eastern cultures that, in the words of Dror Zebi, quote, reveal none of the modern West's fixed, rigid boundaries distinguishing heterosexuality and homosexuality, and almost no sense of deviance from a compelling norm. I'm going to see if I can just flip forward to one image that illustrates that point very nicely. Okay. This is a scene illustrating a brothel from a 16th century Persian manuscript by Sati, which there are a lot of ripple stories in it. What's so fascinating about this image, which I've never seen reproduced, I found it at the British Library, is the porousness of sexuality. It takes place figuratively within the same space. So spatially, we have an architecture that encompasses hetero and homosexuality, as it were, on the same playing field. There are hierarchies within this scene. Usually in miniatures, whatever's in the alcove at the top sort of takes pride of place. There you have older man, younger boy, which conforms to a certain sort of conventional stereotype of sodomy in the Middle East. You have, as well, your conventional heterosexual pairing in two places, man, woman, top, bottom positions. But you have some other sort of things going on, too. Here, I think we should pretty type in there. You have a young guy, fully erect here, who is fondling this woman whose robes he's parted. And here we have two same-age youths having sex with each other. So all at once, that sort of turns over the stereotype that all sexuality happens within Middle Eastern cultures. It follows a gender-coded norm of male penetrating a younger person. Here it's two same-age people. But to me, what's so fascinating there is the way in which it does gloss what Zedi says, that this is a culture with none of the West's rigid boundaries distinguishing hetero and homosexuality, and almost no sense of deviance from a compelling norm. It's hard to say what the norm is here. And just artistically, the fact that it's contained within one space. I mean, I don't think you'd actually walk in a brothel probably and have this. But although I can get into other things I've learned about that too. Sometimes brothels were actually used as places of assignation by men because you could rent cubicles. It's the imagination that can see this together and expect the reader to take that just as part of the narrative there. That's not like how we grew up. The destabilizations that ensue from Europeans' exposure to these alternative understandings of sexuality not only call into question Western conceptions of masculinity, manhood, sexual authority, progress, civilization, they also form a rich terrain for analysis congruent with current theoretical developments in many overlapping fields. Cross-cultural and transnational studies in the history of sexuality, art history and visual culture studies, queer theory, and foremost, the endeavors of Middle Eastern scholars of sexuality to queer their own discipline. This latter scholarship, much of which has appeared since 2005, and I'd be happy if you want titles to share them later, has special resonances for my project. While uncovering and making sense of the homoerotic subtext of Western Orientalism's retellings and representations is valuable in its own right, and that's my dominant focus, this European archive only stands to gain by being read in proximity to the explosion of scholarship now being produced by a generation of sophisticated theorists and historians of sexuality whose fluency in Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish has allowed them to unearth a vast archive of materials that have been suppressed for a long time, illuminating historical constructions of same-sex Islamic sexuality. This Middle Eastern archive makes it possible, as never before, to place the homoeroticizing trajectories of Orientalism into a more dynamic framework that reverberates in intellectually challenging directions. Hence, a secondary aim of my book is to put the representations emanating from European sources into dialogue at appropriate moments with examples selected from this Middle Eastern archive. I do so by employing what Edward Said in Culture and Imperialism has called a contrapuntal mode of analysis. Such a contrapuntal mode of reading allows one to attend, as in music, to various themes playing off one another with no privileging of the one over the other in order to grasp a composite built of all these different agenalities. In such intersections and overlaps, one can begin to perceive those affective desires and queer affinities that, as the person I've already quoted, Al-Qasim puts it, we moderns here in the archive we cannot quite name. That difficulty of any of us who've looked, even you look back to the Victorian period, is it right to call that scene of women coupling in bed lesbianism, female eroticism? Does that even do the work? We intuit what we see or hear, but we don't always have the words for it. I'm arguing that a contrapuntal mode of analysis where you let things come all sorts of angles comes closer to perhaps to helping us feel the composite there. The homoerotics of Orientalism, therefore, deliberately tugs in two directions at once. On the one hand, towards an excavation and interpretation of the sexual politics of Western Orientalism's homoerotic subtext. On the other, toward a contextualization of the Middle Eastern sexual economies that historically have framed these European encounters with alterity. It is my hope that what may at times appear a tension between these two goals becomes instead a productive aspect of this book's methodology, creating intersections that in turn function as interventions, helping us see beyond the oppositional discourse of Middle East versus West, rampant in popular culture and political grandstanding alike. Likewise, it's imperative that we begin to, or at least attempt to open a dialogue between Western Oriental queer theory, whatever its limits, and Islamic studies, whatever turf defenses are going on there. In addition, I argue that using the lens of male homoeroticism to bring Western and Middle Eastern discourses into proximity can, in fact, help dislodge the Eurocentric biases and historic logic that have traditionally organized the binary relation of Orient and Occident in an unequal hierarchy, one in which the West, of course, always represents a more advanced stage of development, while the East is perpetually doomed to play catch-up. In his classic study, Provincializing Europe, Deepesh Chakrabarty posits the ethical necessity of repositioning Europe's intellectual traditions and teleological narratives of progress is simply one part, albeit an important one, of a radically heterogeneous world, rather than as the tacitly assumed center from which all ideas radiate outward to the less enlightened. I'm sure these are issues that many of you borderlands people are quite familiar with within your own discipline. Analogously, I suggest, the unsettling reverberations set into motion by Western encounters with homoeroticism in the Middle East begin to provincialize not only Europe, but its received histories of sexuality, calling into question the self-defeating logic that is traditionally posited East and West, hetero and homosexuality, pre-modern and modern, as mutually exclusive terms. As such, unraveling the homoerotics of Orientalism has the potential to help scholars rethink the distinction between acts-based understandings of sexuality, assumed to be pre-modern, and identity-based understandings, assumed to be modern, that, since Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, has been accepted as axiomatic in studies of sexuality and queer theory. Focusing on the historical interarticulations of Eastern and Western bodies, desires, aesthetic traditions, and analytical paradigms has the power to unsettle the very grounds on which our understanding of East and West alike are devised, revealing in the process the heterogeneities, inconsistencies, and slippages that make up Middle East and West alike. Reading for these interarticulations and complications, these inconsistencies and slippages, as they simultaneously reveal and disclose and disguise their presence in textual expressions, is, of course, and here I'm going to root for my own discipline, the traditional forte of the literary specialist trained to read closely and deeply, attending to nuance, suggestion, indirection, and contradiction in the written word and in the narrative structures and genres used to convey meaning. This fact explains, perhaps, some of our most astute readers of culture began their careers as literary scholars. Likewise, the cultural work undertaken in the homoerotics of Orientalism overwhelmingly owes to the perspective I bring to its sources as a literary scholar trained in close reading, or what I have called elsewhere closely felt reading, and in theories of narrative. For all the materials amassed in my archive, from Italian travel accounts to epic Ottoman poems, from Persian miniatures to French pornography, from Arab ghazal lyrics to Dutch rubaiyats, are forms of cultural storytelling. A fact is true of visual text as written ones. Attending to the complex, often contradictory structures of meaning that exist within and between these myriad stories, asking how they are told as well as why they are told, yields a degree of analytical depth, of interpretive finesse, sometimes absent in cultural studies and in traditional modes of historical research. In contrast, the method of contrapuntal reading I advocate attempts to imagine the interpretive possibilities that exist between the lines, on the micro level of narrative, in order to ferret out the important but sometimes nearly invisible role that a homoerotics of Orientalism has played in constructing the West's received histories of sexuality. On a macro level, as opposed to the micro level, this project aims to contribute to the larger epistemological project of helping undo the binary pairings that have tended to define East and West, conceptions of normative and non-normative sexualities, and practices and identities into oppositional terms. In the process, we can begin to comprehend more accurately the myriad, rather than singular forms of sexuality and eroticism that have in fact always traversed these politically freighted, ideologically constructed divides from a number of directions. Now, two of the figures of speech that I've just used, reading between the lines and reading deeply, merit a few further words of explanation. For at least some historians, and only a few, none in this room. You didn't tell me that there would be historians. For at least some traditional historians who work on the East Coast, the idea of doing what we literary critics do, reading between the lines, is tantamount to finding what is not there, creating castles in the air in lieu of uncovering hard facts. Such activity only confirms the suspicion that literary interpretation is feckless and irresponsible, and no more so that when it attempts to address real-life problems like blah, that's really getting to the heart of the matter. But, as should now be clear, reading between the lines signifies, for my purposes, a critical sensitivity to complexity and nuance, as well as a creative ability, and a real stress on creative ability, to take the betweenness of the words that form the lines on the page as opportunities for rumination, for teasing out the latent possibilities of meaning that their choice, arrangement, connotative possibilities, and placement within larger structures, larger units of structure and generic modes suggest. Such a mode of reading helps us to perceive the subtle ideological layerings and psychological compulsions that compelled the narrative inscription in the first place. In the same vein, the phrase reading deeply means to suggest the activity of paying sustained attention to the multiple discourses that comprise any narrative act, entertaining both the synchronic and diachronic paths that words, phrases, sentences, style, repetition, and verbal echoes and dissonances create in a text. Such connotations of depth shouldn't be confused with what Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, in a famous chapter of one of her later books, identifies as the topos of depth or hiddenness, an intended drama of exposure that she associates with the all too frequent practice of paranoid reading that she claims, with others, has dominated literary and cultural theory for the last 2 decades. As Sedgwick explains, such a hermeneutics of suspicion assumes in advance that a text can only be read against itself or is symptomatic of its own repressions, rediscovering its own gloomy prognosis in every text. That's too easy a move. In contrast, the kind of deep or closely felt reading I have in mind opens one up to surprise, to the unforeseen, to discovery. It heightens the imaginative curiosity, the ability to make surprising connections that underlies lasting scholarship. It makes possible, in the words you've chosen to give this conference, visions of elsewhere that cease to be mere visions and become visionary. Several critics have promoted models that inform my reading methodology, particularly as I create intersections between my European archive of Orientalist erotics and documents, images, and ephemera emanating from various regions of the Middle East. I've already mentioned one such method, Said's concept of reading contrapuntally, in which, as a musical counterpoint, various themes play off each other without one taking precedence. This musical analogy provides, as Said puts it, a non-univocal model, and I quote, for thinking through and interpreting together experiences that are discrepant, each with its particular agenda and pace of development, its own internal formations, its internal coherence, and system of external relationships, yet all of these experiences coexisting and interacting with the others. So it's not just like synthesis, which is, the old model of from difference to synthesis, but rather acknowledging that all the threads and melodies and counter melodies have their own integrities, that each has its own connection to the other melodies, and that it's through opening our ears to all of that that we may begin to hear something more than the univocal sort of melody that we often, as critics, tend to pull through our text too easily at times and then knot up. Another important methodological model from our work lies in the work of post-colonial theorist Anne Laura Stoller, who advocates for reading along the grain of the colonial archive rather than pushing against it, as in much post-colonial and transnational theory. That is, instead of automatically considering European sources only to be skewed and biased, and therefore unlikely to yield anything we don't already know, Stoller encourages the scholar to allow oneself to falter in reading colonial documents, attending to the stammer of the archive, and listening for unsure and hesitant sorts of documentation, what I call the hiccups, that are audible even within the most official-sounding colonial pronouncements and protocols. Reading along rather than against the grain of the colonial archive all the better reveals its contents, and here I'm quoting Stoller, as condensed sites of epistemological and political anxiety, end quote. As one such site, the homoerotics of Orientalism becomes a crucial nodal point for unraveling the intersections and inter-implications of sexuality and power in Western constructions of the East. A third model of reading on which I've drawn lies in Eve Sedgwick's late work in Touching Feeling. Here, she proposes that in order to break out of dualistic or binary ways of thinking, we need to abandon the prepositions beneath and beyond as metaphors for critical interpretation, since both can too easily transform into narratives of origin, what's beneath something due down, you'll find the origin, or telos, what lies on the horizon beyond. In the place of either beneath or beyond, Sedgwick suggests that we embrace the conceptual possibilities of the preposition beside, which suggests that a number of elements, here I'm quoting Sedgwick, may lie alongside one another, though not an infinity of them. So you have the beside sort of movement here. Like Said's notion of contrapuntalism, Sedgwick's beside opens up the possibility of examining a range of desires and affects that exist in relationships that are contingent, proximate, and partial. Such a on a plane perspective is particularly well suited to the study of cross-cultural encounters and sexualities, both of which are inherently multivocal. Even when one relation or set of relations is prioritized, we do prioritize perforce by the very act of writing critically, the governing conception driving one's passion to interpret remains open to dialogue, conditionality, multi-perspectivism, and conceptual complexity. A project of this nature that I've tried to undertake in this book entails lots of challenges, both practical and theoretical, and since some of these may well be ones that many of you grad students in the audience may be facing in your own work, I'd like to briefly touch on 4 conundrums with which I've wrestled. One has to do with this book's temporal scope and geographical breadth, ranging as it does from tales that capture by Algerian corsairs to postmodernist examples of Iranian art. Let's face it, it's difficult enough to honor the specificities of cultural differences and sexual practices within a given era or epoch. Doing so across nations, cultures, and languages complicates the task exponentially. Western scholars analyzing non-European and third world contexts face the added challenge of not wanting to fall into the trap of seeming essentialist, orientalist, or trans-historical. These pitfalls aren't simply ones confronting Western critics, however. In both Western and Eastern scholarship on Islamic gender and sexuality in the past, there's been a tendency indiscriminately to apply text emanating from much earlier periods to the present as evidence of some practices that continue unabated from medieval times to contemporary times. Because that's, say, the one Middle Eastern text you happen to have on your hand, you import the thing way over. So that's a real danger. Yet at the same time, as Middle Eastern historian of sexuality Khalid El-Roheb quite rightly points out, quote, an overemphasis on maintaining differences in the name of some presupposed cultural and authenticity, end quote, can obscure continuities that do exist over time and region, continuities that make systematic analysis both possible and desirable. A second challenge involves what might be seen as the Eurocentrism of a project that prioritizes Western perspectives and literary imaginings of the Middle East. Such a concern relates to transnational theories called to center Europe as the fount from which knowledge flows outwards to third world geographies. While the Western writers and artists considered in my study, including Loti, Flaubert, Durrell, Mailer, and Gide, among many others, indeed make non-Western societies their subject matter, and sometimes do so, frankly, by objectifying and speaking for the objects of their contemplation, I'd like to emphasize that the act of representing alterity, as several recent theorists of travel narrative also suggest, does not mean that all perceptions originating in the West are inevitably made in bad faith. Such a viewpoint overlooks the degree to which the dialogic nature of such exchanges may inform and at times transform the narrating observer. In other words, the traveler may him or herself be in that interchange that happens and that transitional or contact zone emerge differently or become a self that is different than the one that left behind. Things happen, whether we're traveling imaginatively or literally. Things can happen. A third challenge this work faces is that writing frankly yet inoffensively about homosexuality in the context of the Middle East. Iranian scholar Janet Afari glosses this problem. She's written a great book on sexuality in modern Iran, in which she does a lot with homosexuality. She glosses this problem when she notes that she's found even speaking about the pervasive homoeroticism of the region's pre-modern culture has been labeled by some of her colleagues Orientalism. Potentially offensive words or concepts are one matter. Visual images are another, and some strong responses to the visual component of my research over the years has instructed me. Yes, all Western-based critics need to be careful not to lapse into armchair sexual tourism or voyeurism when discussing non-Western desires and erotics. But I do think we need to be suspicious about the underlying motives that have occasionally caused gay-focused work on the Middle East to be singled out as especially exploitative. While a thoughtful analysis of the photographic images of semi-nude male models shot in Tunis and Cairo by the studio of Leonard and Landrock should incite a more negative response the Malik Alula's reproduction of postcards of nude harem women in Algeria. This speaks, I suspect, a degree of unconscious homophobia at work. For my part, I've attempted to be clear that the sexually explicit materials incorporated in my book, whether visual or textual, are integral parts of an overall argument, not simply descriptive iterations that uncritically repeat the exoticism of the work being examined. A fourth, and this is perhaps the most significant challenge tackled by this book, has to do with ongoing debates in queer theory and in studies of Middle Eastern sexuality about the mere efficacy of using concepts of homosexuality, gay identity, and queerness as they have evolved in the modern West to describe Middle East formations of same-sex desire over time. These arguments go in many directions, from sensible admonishments to avoid anachronistically applying the term homosexuality to sexual cultures that operate outside the hetero-homo binary, to stern warnings that the worldwide globalization of gay identity is yet one more negative example of a colonial narrative of development and progress, a narrative in which the West's missionary efforts are necessitated by the backwardness of non-Western cultures as the latter effort to achieve modern sexual liberation. And yet, ironically, sometimes those very critics who most vociferously argue against collapsing Western and non-Western formations of same-sex male desire unthinkingly fall back on a somewhat facile distinction between sexual acts and sexual identities inherited from Foucault as a default mode of understanding Middle East homoeroticism. I've already sort of gestured to that and the Persian miniature, the convention that many critics fall back on, well, in the Middle East, sexuality and positionality is more gender determinative. It all depends on who is penetrating and who is being penetrated. My work suggests that this distinction obscures the actual interplay of practices, what one does, and identity, what one thinks one is, throughout Islamic history up to the beginning of the 20th century. The self-declared lover of boys in early modern Ottoman and Persian society may not profess a homosexual identity in the modern sense, but neither is he simply performing an act, as the very emotions, romantic love as well as sexual desire, with which he invests the object of his affection and reams of poetry and other kinds of narrative attest. As thorny as some of these questions are, what is clear is the degree to which Foucault's famous distinction between an Eastern ars erotica based on acts and a Western scientia sexualis based on identities is not only historically inaccurate in terms of Middle East history, it is also orientalizing. One outcome of the assimilation of Foucault's ideas has been, as I've already noted, increasingly politicized debates about whether either modern gay identity or queer theory as a mode of analysis originating in the first world is transferable to non-Western context, or whether both signal a further colonizing of the Third World by American and European power. Joseph Massad, in a book, 2007 book titled Desiring Arabs, denounces gay human rights organizations working in the Middle East for imposing their Western understandings of gayness on Middle Eastern sexual ontologies. And examples I could give later, and that sort of represents one extreme of this kind of argument or case for not importing things. Even as other theorists of Islamic sexuality warns against the tendency that they see in Massad to a kind of reverse essentialism and one-decided defenses of cultural authenticity. Another variation of Massad's stance resonates in Jasper Puar's definition in her book, Terrorist Assemblages, of homo-nationalism as the project whereby gay U.S. citizens, so happy finally to be embraced by the nation-state in this day and age, collaborate in demonizing Muslims as queerly perverse terrorists. I would suggest, however, that while it is of course crucial to resist the cultural imperialism implicit in any one-way importation of concepts derived largely from European and Anglo-American perspectives onto another culture. It is quite another thing to create binaries so absolute that one is either totally complicit in hegemonic violence against the other or totally the victim of outside forces imposing their ideologies on you. One corollary of such suspicion-laden or paranoid readings is the implication that any Muslim or Arab who embraces Western gay ideals, increased visibility, civil rights, equality, has been co-opted by the West. Such a logic overlooks the fact that these men and women are sexual subjects whose choices, desires, and self-identifications are, like those of Western men and women, always in the process of change and evolution in ways that cannot be predicted. Arjun Appaduri's insights into the workings of globalization and modernity at large weigh in usefully in this context. As he reminds us, and I quote, globalization is itself a deeply historical, uneven, and ever-localizing process. Different societies appropriate the methods of modernity differently, end quote. Local cultures, that is, annex the global into their own practices in ways that often make it work for them. And the same can hold for imported concepts like gay and lesbian identity or queer theory. Thus, Ruth Benita forcefully argues for the political and everyday usefulness of the term gay in contemporary India, noting the irony that often those who rail most vociferously against the use of the terms gay or lesbian in third world context are those who have already obtained most of their basic civil rights and liberties in first world environments. Likewise, in a study of same-sex desires in Thailand, Peter Jackson shows how the circulation of the word gay in contemporary Thai culture illustrates the ways in which Western conceptions of homosexuality and gay identity are being borrowed, retooled, and transformed to fit the priorities of the local culture. In the process, he writes, such terms are becoming as much Thai as Western, if not more so, end quote. As so often, Eve Sedgwick deserves the last word on these complex issues. Literary and cultural critics, she urges, need to attend to the middle ranges of agency, that theories relying too strongly on the opposition between hegemony and subversion fail to capture. This intermediate zone, where most subjectivities are in fact lived, she writes, offers the only effectual space for creativity and change. Listening to the voices of that middle range through the cross-cultural and contrapuntal analysis of the homoerotics of Orientalism is my goal in this book. I write convinced that it is time to find more flexible ways of analyzing the traces of desires past and present, echoing across spaces and traversing populations, cultures, and subcultures, disciplinary fields, and individuals. One step is to trust our intuitions and honor the human desire to explore other cultures and understand alternative ways of being in the world, even at the risk of revealing the limits of our knowledge and the blind spots that our subject positions inevitably create. Rather than seeing these limits as reasons to desist and advance, I prefer to view them as shared intersecting boundaries that, in touching upon and overlapping with other scholars' areas of expertise and training, extend the flow of knowledge and discovery beyond ourselves. In contrast to the hermeneutics of suspicion that has achieved widespread currency in the academy, Sedgwick calls for reparative modes of reading that seek to ameliorate, to bring together, rather than to attack and dismantle. Several years ago, my colleague, David Roman, made an eloquent plea for an academic ethos of critical generosity. Between these two concepts, reparative reading and critical generosity, an alternative way of knowing, sharing, and producing knowledge glimmers, living a conceptual framework in which the effective desires, pleasures, politics, and hopes driving the lives we lead and the work we do participate in a community of deeply felt, richly imagined scholarship. I'd like to close with a simple observation. namely that the intellectual desire to communicate ideas, to make connections, to make a connection that motivates the critical act of scholarship, shares something in common with the deep human desire present in most cultures to travel to strange lands, to entertain visions of elsewhere, in order to encounter the unknown and familiar, most often experienced in the form of cultural difference. As the homoerotics of Orientalism shows, the physical as well as imaginative impulse to cross borders and enter the realms of the foreign and unknown is not simply a case of establishing unidirectional domination or penetration over some monolithic Middle Eastern Orient. The act of crossing, whether traveling, writing, or reading, also tacitly signifies one's willingness to offer oneself up to unsuspected multiple ways of being. The traveling mind and the mindful traveler become, in such instances, intimate participants as well as spectators in culture-specific situations that, on occasion, transform hitherto unquestioned certitudes into unknowns that must be confronted and worked through. Nearly 4 centuries ago, an manual I found at the Huntington Library, auspiciously titled Instructions and Directions for Foreign Travel, but in 1650, James Howe warned his travelers in language that seems ready-made for the literary critic of culture. And I quote, "Foreign travel oftentimes makes many to wander from themselves as well as from their countries. They go out figures and return ciphers. What geographies might lie beyond the thresholds of scholarly imagination, waiting to be refigured if more of us wandered from ourselves and wandering from our countries, if more of us relinquished our preconceived notions of right and wrong, power and discipline, normativity and marginality, sameness and difference, distance and proximity, self and other? How, too, might the terms homoeroticism and Orientalism, the 2 operative words in my book's title, each find itself refigured, wrenched apart, and reconjoined to create new meanings through their contrapuntal engagement both with each other and with the ever-ongoing process of cross-cultural exchange? Opening ourselves up to the possibility of such new meanings, of such visions of elsewhere, is, in sum, the threshold across which my book invites its readers to venture." That's a rhythm.